When you look at the story of the calling of the disciples in the Gospels, you realize that Jesus has a very clear agenda of where he wants to take them. But he knows that he can't explain that to them straight away. And so initially the calling is very simple and very gentle. It's simply come and see. Come and spend time with me. Come and hear my word. Come and see what I'm doing. And so they come and they hear this gospel of life. They see these miracles. And very quickly there are crowds gathering in the thousands. Because at this point, what Jesus is proclaiming is really the fulfillment of what everyone wants. We want life here on earth to be even better than it is. And so if this is the guy who can take away sickness and sadness and grief, then we're all in. But there is a deeper part of the message which Jesus needs to explain to them, but he knows that they can't understand it. And it's basically the message of the cross. Now, as much as for us as Christians, we claim the cross as our symbol. You know, this is the universal mark of Christianity. But the question is, how many of us actually understand the paradox of what this message actually is? Because it's this message that somehow it's through failure that you will achieve victory. It's through death that you will gain life. It's through losing everything that you'll actually be completely fulfilled. That doesn't kind of work in our small puny brains. We can't comprehend that bit. And so what you start to see is there is this growing tension between Jesus and the disciples because they don't understand where he's going. As he starts to try to explain to them where this mission is now leading to. And he starts to say things like, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross and follow me. Now, they understood what the cross was because this was state-sponsored execution. You know, for us these days, we hear that line and we think, oh, Jesus wants us to just bear our sufferings. But he was saying, this is not going to end well. But you can't be my disciple unless you're prepared to go to that level. As he says, you know, anyone who tries to save their life will lose it, but anyone who loses their life for my sake will save it. Now you could imagine the disciples sitting around thinking, this is very different to what we heard a year ago. You know, something's shifted here, something's changed, and we're now not quite sure whether we want to keep following because this is not what we signed up for. Now, there's a point where they can only follow when in some way they've had some sort of guarantee of who this person is. And this is where we come to this decisive moment we've just heard. It always falls halfway between the gospel. You know, particularly in Mark's gospel, it's exactly halfway. Like the whole gospel is divided on this point. Where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. He leaves the others behind. You know, we don't quite know why. Maybe these were the ones that he thought have got the best chance of understanding. But he leads them to the top of a mountain. He leads them into silence. Up until now, everything has been about the crowd. And you can imagine this great religious fervor, the way crowds operate. You know, everyone gets very emotional, everyone gets caught up in it, everyone's like, yeah, we're going to follow you to the ends of the earth. But Jesus now does the opposite. He says, come into the silence and just wait and watch. And you get the impression that this took a long time. You know, I think it's in Luke's gospel where it talks about how they were overcome by sleep. You know, if you've ever tried to have a time of prayer and you've fallen asleep, you know what these guys were going through. Because a lot of the time, it feels like God's not doing anything. It feels like you're there and God's absent. That was precisely the experience of these three disciples. But it's in that moment, and particularly at that moment when they're the most bored or they're the most overcome by fatigue, something happens. And Jesus is transformed. He's radiant. This glory of his divinity, which has been in some way hidden from them, kind of masked behind this veil of his humanity, the full glory of his divinity now shines forth. And they're overwhelmed. They're almost babbling, making no sense. But in this place, they suddenly realize this is who he is. He's not just a good moral teacher. He's not just a miracle worker. This is the Lord of heaven and earth. This is God. We still don't understand where he's calling us to, but we're going to follow because we know who he is. And so from this point, as they descend this mountain, the whole focus now goes towards another hill, that of the hill of Calvary. And you start to see that Jesus' focus is now all towards the cross. The other disciples who were not here are still struggling. And in some sense, they're kind of now following Peter, James, and John because they're walking with confidence and boldness. This story is so important because it's meant to become personal for you. You are on this same journey of discipleship. And in some sense, you should say, well, where are you? Are you still at the beginning of the gospel, part of the crowd? Many of those people in the crowd were following simply because everyone else was there. If everyone else left, they would probably leave as well. Very often our trust is based on the fact that we believe somebody else knows what's going on. There comes this point where Jesus now draws you deeper. And he says, I want you to understand my purpose for your life. I want you to understand where I'm leading you to follow me to the cross and to understand how that makes sense. It's only when you've had a place of encounter. And this is where I think it's so important that we actually step away from the noise. We step away from the crowd, even from a lot of the emotion and the hype of our faith sometimes, and just say, I want to sit in that still, silent place and wait. Now, that's a very awkward space to be in because we can't force God to turn up on our timeline. I think sometimes as a church, there's almost a temptation for us to try to manufacture an encounter. We see this in some churches where a lot of the way of the preaching, of the music, it's almost trying to stir up an encounter within the context of the crowd. But again, when the crowd dissipates, people walk away. Within our church tradition, there has always been this space of going into the desert, or going into the silence, and just encountering the God who speaks in silence. Now that encounter is not what you expect it to be. I know a lot of people who go on silent retreats and they kind of expect that by day 2, God is going to appear in glory and they're going to be filled with consolation and emotion and know that God exists. And almost every time I hear these people coming back saying they're almost disappointed because that didn't happen. Because that's not the way it works. This transfiguration moment, this moment of encounter is nothing known to the senses. That's that beautiful line in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 12. That what we've come to is nothing known to the senses. Our senses fail us at this point. But what we encounter is something at a level so much deeper, at that level of just knowing, of encountering deep at that level of faith. that the God who made you delights in you and he is present to you. And sometimes that encounter can just be the most fleeting moment. You know, you could spend hours in prayer and it's just like a fraction of a second. But I've seen so many people who walk away from that moment saying, this is real. I can never deny it. Now, the reason why this is so important is because in some sense, we can't take that next step of discipleship without that encounter. And at the same time, it's so hard for other people to make sense of that journey of discipleship if they haven't encountered themselves. You know, over the years, I've had many parents come to me saying, my child seems to have gone completely insane. All they want to do now is follow Jesus and live the rest of their life as a missionary, or to run off and become a priest or a nun or join a monastery. And you have to tell them to stop because this is madness. You know, we've invested years for them to become a lawyer or a doctor. We don't want them to go and waste it on such trivial things. And in some sense, because the parents are still down in the valley in the crowd. They're still understanding Christianity from the perspective where it's very sensible and very rational and very ordinary. And yet their child has now encountered something of this mountaintop experience where they realize this is the whole reason we breathe. It's all about Jesus, and they want to now live their whole existence for him. You know, where they are now prepared to walk towards Calvary without hesitation because of what they've seen. As a church, we need to come to that space, like every single one of us. I think if you go to any church in the world, you'll find there are a small number of people who are basically driving everything. You know, those who have just given their whole life to follow Christ. And often they're the ones driving the parish or driving the church. And everyone else is kind of dragged along just thinking this is a great idea. Those small number of people are often the ones who have had the courage to step into the silent space and to allow God to reveal his love to them. And through that, they've now seen the whole world differently. Now for us in this time of Lent, this 40 days of preparation for Easter, this is a tradition that goes way back to the early church. And it has always been this understanding that in the same way that the Israelites spent 40 years in the desert, we spend 40 days kind of in this virtual desert. And it's meant to be a place where we strip away the noise and we try to just spend that time in prayer, in that silent encounter with the Lord. Because we know where we're going to. We are heading towards Good Friday. We're heading towards the cross. But we need to have that hope of what lies on the other side of the resurrection. And to really come to that place of encounter that this is the God of heaven and earth who has humbled himself to this point of being crucified. And if he has humbled himself that much, then I should have no fear of doing the same. And so it's only through this place that we can really walk with confidence. We can start to understand what this call of Jesus actually is. So I want to really encourage you. We live in a world where there is so much noise. But try to carve out some space of silence in these coming weeks. You know, whether that is coming to the church during the day, you know, when you finish your shift at work, the church is always open during the day here. Just come and just sit. You know, often when we come to pray, we feel like we've got to say stuff, we've got to do stuff, we've got to sing songs or say prayers. Just come and just sit in the silence and just say, Lord, encounter me. Help me to know that this is real. Help me to actually see something of the truth of this. a glimpse of your glory, even if it's just for the tiniest moment, so that I can now have the courage to walk from this mountain towards Calvary with you. So let's just simply pray. So Lord, pour your grace upon us. Give us the courage to enter into that silent, secret place with you. And Lord, break through the noise and the distraction of our hearts, that we could know you in a way we've never known before. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.